I'd lived in the same neighborhood for years, minding my own business, enjoying the peace and quiet. That is, until one morning I noticed something strange. A new device had appeared on my roof. It wasn't there the day before, and I certainly hadn't asked for it. At first, I thought maybe it was just some random contractor working on the building. But as the days went by, more and more of these strange boxes started popping up, not just on my roof, but across the whole neighborhood. I didn't think much of it until I realized these weren't just any devices. They were Wi-Fi repeaters. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Now, let me explain something. I'm not some tech expert, but I do know my rights, and I do know that you can't just use someone else's property without permission. Especially not for your own benefit. That's when it hit me. These repeaters weren't here for some neighborhood upgrade or service improvement. They were installed by the HOA without so much as a heads up. The HOA had literally put equipment on my roof to extend their internet network, and they didn't bother to ask me about it. No notice, no approval, nothing. Naturally, I had some questions. How did this happen? Did I have a say in it? Was I being charged for this? I wasn't even sure how they had the right to come onto my property like this. I had no idea when they'd installed them or why I hadn't noticed sooner. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to just let it slide. At first, I tried to be calm about it. Maybe they were just trying to improve things, I thought. Maybe they were doing it for the common good. But then it dawned on me, these devices were using my internet connection. I was paying for the bandwidth, and now the HOA was just freely using it without so much as a thank you. I wasn't even sure if they were supposed to be doing that. They had access to my roof, but did they have access to my Wi-Fi? Was this legal? I decided I needed answers. The first thing I did was call the HOA office, asking about the repeaters. Of course, they didn't give me a straight answer. They acted like it was no big deal, like they had every right to install whatever they wanted on my property. That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a simple misunderstanding. This was a situation where they thought they could do whatever they wanted without considering anyone else. That was the moment I knew something had to be done. I wasn't going to sit back and let them run over me like this. It wasn't just about the Wi-Fi, it was about respect for my space, my property, and my rights. I started thinking of a plan, but I wasn't sure where to start. I didn't want to cause unnecessary drama, but I also wasn't going to let them get away with it. They had crossed a line, and I had every right to defend my property. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I couldn't believe the HOA had just decided to use my property without my permission, especially when it came to something as personal as my Wi-Fi connection. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it felt like a violation. They had no right to take advantage of my resources like this. It wasn't like they'd asked me first, or even offered any compensation for using my internet. They just expected me to go along with it, like I wouldn't notice or care. I started digging into this whole situation, trying to figure out exactly what my rights were. After all, I didn't want to overreact. I needed to understand if I had any legal ground to stand on before making any big moves. The more I researched, the more I realized just how overstepping the HOA had been. In some areas, homeowners can be required to let the HOA install certain things on their property, but Wi-Fi repeaters weren't one of those things. They were basically using my internet bandwidth for free, and that was not okay. It wasn't like they were contributing to the cost in any way. I wasn't going to let this slide, so I decided to take action. But what was I supposed to do? I didn't want to get into some long, drawn-out legal battle, but I also couldn't let them walk all over me. Then it hit me. The most obvious solution was staring me in the face. I could switch my internet provider. I could get a new plan, and while I was at it, I could make sure that the HOA paid for the bandwidth they were using. It wasn't as simple as just changing the provider. I had to plan it carefully. I didn't want them to catch on too early. I had to make sure that they wouldn't know what was coming until it was too late. But once I made the switch, I realized just how satisfying this was going to be. The idea of charging the HOA for the bandwidth they were freeloading off of was, in a way, poetic justice. They thought they could use my property without asking? Well, I would turn the tables on them. They'd be the ones paying for access to my Wi-Fi, not the other way around. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about sending a message. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted anymore. They had to pay the price for taking advantage of me, for thinking they could get away with using my property for their convenience without so much as a thank you. It felt good to be in control again. This wasn't just a technical issue or a financial one, it was about standing up for my rights. And I was ready to fight for them. As I waited for the new provider to set up everything, I couldn't help but smile. I knew that once the HOA realized what I had done, they wouldn't be happy. But in a way, that made it even more enjoyable. I was about to turn their little power play into something they'd have to pay for, literally. I remember the first time I checked the new setup. Everything was in place. New provider, new account, and a fresh start. I made sure to double-check everything, especially the bandwidth usage. The last thing I wanted was to look unprepared when the HOA came knocking. I had everything neatly documented and ready to go. If they thought they could get away with freeloading off my internet, they were in for a surprise. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I could already imagine their reaction when they realized what I had done. I'd like to say I was nervous, but honestly, I was more excited. This was a moment of victory for me, standing up for my property and my rights. It wasn't just about the Wi-Fi repeaters anymore. It was about showing them that I wasn't someone they could push around. It didn't take long before the first signs of trouble appeared. A few days after I switched to the new provider, I received an email from the HOA. It was polite on the surface, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath the words. They were asking me why my internet service had changed, and more importantly, why the repeaters seemed to be offline. They were hinting at the fact that they knew something had changed, but they weren't coming right out and saying it. I could tell they were trying to be careful, probably because they didn't want to admit that they'd messed up in the first place. I wasn't ready to respond just yet. I had to play it cool, to make them sweat a little. The longer they waited, the more they'd realize they were stuck. And sure enough, a few days later, I received another email. This one was more urgent. They were complaining about a disruption to the Wi-Fi network and how it was affecting the neighborhood. It was almost laughable. These were the same people who had decided to install repeaters on my roof without permission, and now they were acting like I was the one causing the problem. I didn't waste any time. I shot back a quick response, explaining that the previous internet service had been canceled due to technical reasons. I didn't give them much more than that, just enough to keep them guessing. Then, just to drive the point home, I attached a document showing my new internet provider's setup and billing details. And that's when the real fun began. It didn't take long for the HOA to get in touch again, this time with a phone call. I could hear the frustration in their voices as they tried to figure out how they'd been caught in this situation. They were stammering, asking why I hadn't notified them about the change, and trying to convince me that they needed the Wi-Fi repeaters back up and running immediately. But I wasn't about to cave in. I could already sense what was coming next. They were going to ask me to turn everything back on, to let them off the hook. But that wasn't happening. The more they begged, the more I realized just how much power I now held in this situation. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was the one calling the shots. They were the ones who were going to have to pay for the privilege of using my bandwidth, and they knew it. The phone call with the HOA didn't go as they had hoped. They tried to negotiate, suggesting all sorts of ways to resolve the issue quickly. One of them even mentioned that they could cover the cost of my new provider if I just let them use the Wi-Fi repeaters again. They were so desperate to get the service back, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. I kept my responses calm but firm. I wasn't going to just let them off the hook with a simple apology. If they wanted to use my Wi-Fi, they would have to pay for it. It was that simple. The way they tried to downplay their actions, like I was supposed to just forgive and forget, made me even more determined to stick to my decision. This wasn't just about a Wi-Fi dispute, it was about the principle. They had taken advantage of me without asking, and I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying things like, "It's for the good of the community," and "the neighborhood benefits from the Wi-Fi network." But that wasn't the point. The point was that they had used my property for their gain without asking. If they truly cared about the community, they would have at least given me a heads up before installing anything on my roof. As the conversation went on, their tone shifted. They stopped being polite and started to get more aggressive. One of the HOA board members even threatened that they might take legal action if I didn't cooperate. That's when I realized just how much they were in the wrong. If they were trying to intimidate me with threats, they didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't scared of their empty threats. I knew I had the law on my side, and I wasn't backing down. They made it clear that they weren't happy about the situation, but they had no choice but to comply with my terms. I wasn't going to let them use my internet without paying for it. In the end, they agreed to settle, on my terms. They would pay for the bandwidth they had been using, and they would have to cover the cost of the new internet provider's setup fee as well. It was a small victory, but it felt so good to finally have the upper hand. I couldn't help but chuckle at the situation. They had underestimated me, thinking they could just use my property without any consequences. Now, they were the ones having to pay for their oversight. But the most satisfying part? The sense of justice. I had stood up for myself, and I wasn't about to let anyone take advantage of me again. The payment wasn't the end of it, though. I could tell they were still seething, probably wondering how they'd been outsmarted in a situation they thought they had complete control over. The HOA had tried to force their way onto my property, and now they were paying for the privilege of using my internet. I wasn't going to let them forget how easy it was to turn the tables on them. A few days later, I got another email from the HOA, but this one was different. They weren't asking for favors anymore. Instead, it was a demand for me to stop charging them for the bandwidth. They had the nerve to say that they were reconsidering how they were managing their network and that the situation had caused them undue stress. They made it sound like I was the one in the wrong, like I was the one who had caused all this drama. But I wasn't fooled. They didn't want to admit that they had made a huge mistake by overstepping their bounds. They just wanted to avoid paying for the bandwidth they were using. But here's the thing. Once I had the upper hand, I wasn't letting go. I wasn't going to let them bully me into backing down. They had thought they could just install repeaters on my roof and use my Wi-Fi like it was no big deal. Now they were facing the consequences, and there was no way I was going to let them get off easy. I wasn't about to stop charging them, and they knew it. By now, I had started to wonder how many other people in the neighborhood had experienced something similar. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the HOA probably treated other homeowners the same way. They probably assumed they could just walk into anyone's property and do whatever they wanted. But this was my property, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. Eventually, I did receive a call from one of the board members. They were much more polite this time, no longer demanding anything. It was almost as if they were hoping I'd be sympathetic, like they thought I'd suddenly change my mind. But I wasn't having it. I told them I expected the payments to continue, and I also let them know that if they wanted to use my roof again in the future, they'd need to get my permission, and pay up front. That was the deal, plain and simple. For the first time, I could hear some genuine respect in their voices. They were no longer trying to intimidate me or make me feel guilty for standing my ground. Instead, they acknowledged that they had messed up, and they were willing to follow my terms from that point forward. It was a small victory, but it felt like a huge one. The whole experience had been a reminder to me that you don't have to let people walk all over you. Sometimes, you have to take matters into your own hands, stand up for yourself, and make sure people understand that your rights matter. It wasn't just about the Wi-Fi. It was about making sure I wasn't taken advantage of anymore. And honestly, the satisfaction of knowing I had the last word? That was the best part of all. Things settled down for a while after that. The HOA reluctantly agreed to the terms, and the payments started flowing in regularly, just as I had planned. It was strangely satisfying to see the checks come through, knowing I was getting paid for something they had no right to use in the first place. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the money. This was about something bigger, standing up for my space, my rights, and not letting anyone push me around. The situation did have a ripple effect, though. Word got around in the neighborhood, and it wasn't long before I started hearing stories from other residents. Some of them shared that they'd noticed the repeaters but hadn't known what to do about them. Others admitted they'd quietly accepted the HOA's decisions, afraid to make waves. It was eye-opening. It made me realize just how often homeowners let the HOA get away with things they shouldn't. The HOA had been operating under the assumption that no one would question their authority or stand up to them. Well, I had done both, and the results were pretty clear. It wasn't long before I got a call from a neighbor. He was asking for advice on what to do about some recent changes in the neighborhood. Apparently, the HOA had been planning some new upgrades to the community's infrastructure, and it seemed like they were trying to pull the same kind of thing again. The difference was, this time, they were trying to sneak in a fee for services that would directly impact homeowners. I told him about my experience and how, if he felt uncomfortable with what the HOA was doing, he didn't have to accept it. That conversation made me realize something else. I wasn't just standing up for myself anymore. I was setting an example. The whole experience had empowered me, and now I could help others do the same. I wasn't the only one affected by the HOA's overreach. So many others had been quietly dealing with the same issues, unsure of how to challenge the system. But with one simple decision, I had shown them that they didn't have to put up with it. The HOA, of course, wasn't thrilled with how things turned out, but they were slowly starting to realize they couldn't just steamroll everyone. They had to be more careful with what they did on other people's property. The power dynamic had shifted. They had learned that there were consequences to taking liberties with someone else's space. And that was something I'd hoped for all along. Not just for me, but for anyone in the neighborhood who had been taken advantage of. After everything had settled, I found myself in a strange position. I didn't want to be the person constantly battling the HOA, but at the same time, I had this newfound confidence. I knew that I could stand up for myself when it mattered. I had a voice, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The HOA had messed with the wrong homeowner, and now they had to deal with the fallout. That made all the difference. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice a change in the way the HOA interacted with me. It was subtle at first, but it was definitely there. They became more polite, more cautious in their approach. Whenever they needed something from me, there was a certain level of formality that wasn't there before. I think they finally realized they couldn't just push me around anymore. And honestly, I wasn't bothered by it at all. In fact, it felt like a small victory every time I saw them tread carefully around me. The other homeowners seemed to be taking notice too. More and more people started coming to me for advice on how to deal with the HOA. Some were frustrated with the way things had been handled in the past. Others were simply curious about what I had done to make such an impact. It was clear that the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they had once seemed. The more I talked about my experience, the more people were beginning to realize that they had the power to push back if something didn't feel right. They didn't have to accept every decision the HOA made without question. One day, a neighbor I barely knew came up to me at the mailbox. He asked if I was the person who had messed with the HOA over the Wi-Fi. I chuckled a little, nodding in confirmation. He told me that after hearing about what I'd done, he was considering challenging a recent increase in the HOA fees. He felt like it was unreasonable and wasn't being put to good use. That moment felt like validation. What I had done had sparked something bigger than just one isolated incident. It was starting to create a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. But the most surprising part, the HOA didn't push back as hard as I thought they would. Sure, they grumbled about the situation, but they weren't making any drastic moves to retaliate. Maybe they were worried about setting a precedent, or maybe they were just scared of further embarrassing themselves. Either way, I was more than ready for whatever came next. If they tried to pull any more fast ones, I'd be prepared. One morning, I received another letter from the HOA, but this time, it wasn't a complaint or a demand. It was an invitation to a neighborhood meeting, where they promised to discuss future projects and improvements. That, in itself, was interesting. It was almost like they were trying to reassert their influence, but in a much softer way. They knew they had to tread carefully now, and that was something I wasn't going to forget. I showed up to the meeting, not really sure what to expect. The atmosphere was definitely different. There was a sense of unease among the board members, like they weren't sure how to approach the homeowners anymore. As the meeting went on, It became clear that they were trying to present themselves as more transparent, more willing to listen. I couldn't help but smile to myself. I had made them change the way they operated. That was something I'd never expected when this all started. And it felt good to know that I wasn't just standing up for myself, but for anyone who had ever been brushed aside by the HOA. A few weeks after the HOA meeting, things in the neighborhood started to feel different. The board members, who had once acted like they were untouchable, were now walking around with a certain hesitance. They were no longer the commanding presence they once were. I started seeing more homeowners attend HOA meetings, something that had never really happened before. It was like the energy in the neighborhood had shifted, and it was all because of that one decision I had made. I wasn't just standing up for my property anymore. I was setting an example that others could follow. What was even more interesting was how the other board members seemed to keep their distance from me. Whenever I ran into them around the neighborhood, they would nod or give a quick greeting, but it was all very formal. I could tell they didn't want to push things too far. Maybe they were trying to avoid conflict, or maybe they realized that they had underestimated me. Either way, it was a clear change in how they interacted with me, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction every time it happened. But it wasn't just the HOA members who were changing. The neighbors were becoming more outspoken too. I overheard conversations at the local coffee shop, and at the grocery store, people were talking about the Wi-Fi situation. One neighbor mentioned that they had seen the HOA become more cautious with their decisions, thinking twice before making any big changes. It was like my little protest had sparked something larger. It felt like I had unknowingly become a symbol of resistance against an authority that had been pushing its weight around for far too long. I wasn't the only one benefiting from this newfound empowerment. Other homeowners were starting to challenge some of the HOA's rules, questioning the legitimacy of fees, and even raising concerns about the neighborhood's maintenance projects. For the first time, the board had to consider the opinions of the people they were supposed to represent. It wasn't a perfect situation, and not every issue was resolved right away, but there was a noticeable shift in how the HOA was handling things. A couple of months later, I ran into another neighbor who had been directly impacted by the HOA's rules. She told me that she had started questioning some of the restrictive covenants that the HOA had been enforcing without explanation. She had always been too intimidated to speak up, but after hearing my story, she decided to do something about it. She told the HOA that she wanted to change the community guidelines about home renovations, arguing that it was unreasonable to require such strict approvals for simple updates. It was refreshing to see that my decision had inspired others to speak up and demand more from their HOA. The best part was that the more the HOA tried to regain control, the more they seemed to realize that they couldn't just steamroll the community anymore. They were being forced to take a step back and consider the homeowners' voices. That sense of empowerment, the realization that we all had a right to be heard, was something that I had never expected when I first made the decision to stand my ground. What started as a small act of rebellion over Wi-Fi repeaters had turned into a larger movement of accountability. And while the HOA might never admit it, they knew they had been forced to change.